The silence was deafening. That's what I remember most about that moment when my father stood at the podium, champagne glass raised, surrounded by 300 guests celebrating his 40-year career building Henderson Construction from a two-man operation into a regional powerhouse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light across faces I'd known, my entire life, business partners, employees, family friends, all waiting for his final toast as CEO. His eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom of the Marriott downtown, and I actually smiled, thinking maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment he'd finally acknowledge what I'd accomplished, what I'd contributed to the company he was about to leave behind. Instead, he cleared his throat and said the words that would change everything. I've been blessed with 3 children, and I'm proud to say 2 of them have exceeded every expectation I had as a father. He gestured toward my older brother Marcus, who straightened his tie with that familiar smirk, and my younger sister Claire, who blushed prettily as she always did when receiving praise. But every family has its disappointments, he continued, his voice carrying that particular tone of resignation I knew so well. Angela has always been my greatest challenge, my one failure as both a father and a mentor. Despite every opportunity I've given her, she's never quite managed to find her place in this world. The room didn't gasp. They didn't need to. The collective intake of breath was subtle, polite, devastating. A few people glanced my way with that look of pity mixed with secondhand embarrassment. Most just stared into their drinks, pretending. They hadn't heard the CEO of Henderson Construction publicly label his middle child a failure at his own retirement party. I sat there in my navy dress, the one I'd carefully selected because it was professional but not too flashy, appropriate but not attention-seeking, everything I'd trained myself to be in his presence, and felt something fundamental shift inside, my chest. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out like some part of me wanted to. Instead, I lifted my own champagne glass, took a slow sip, and waited. Because what my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 7 minutes, the chairman of the board would take that same podium and announce the new CEO of Henderson Construction. And that person wouldn't be Marcus, despite his MBA and his corner office. It wouldn't be some outside hire they'd been courting for months. It would be me, Angela Henderson, the daughter he'd just called his greatest failure in front of everyone who mattered in our industry. My name is Angela Henderson, and from wherever you're tuning in from, stay with me, because the night my father wrote me off as his biggest disappointment was the night I rewrote the entire Henderson legacy I learned early, that being the middle child in a family business meant being invisible in all the ways that mattered and hypervisible in all the ways that didn't. While Marcus got groomed for leadership from the time he could hold a level, and Claire got praised for her social graces and her ability to charm clients at company events, I got lectures about finding my lane, staying in my place, and not trying. So hard to prove myself in spaces where I clearly didn't belong. My mother, Linda, tried to soften the edges of my father's dismissal with gentle redirections. "Angela, honey, maybe you'd be happier in marketing at some other company," she'd suggest over family dinners where the conversation inevitably turned to business strategy and quarterly projections. "You're so creative, so good with people. Henderson, construction might just be too technical for your strengths." She meant well, I think, but every suggestion that I'd be better suited somewhere else felt like another door closing, another message that I wasn't Henderson material. Growing up in Denver, our house on Cherry Creek Drive was the kind of place where business happened over breakfast and contracts got discussed over dinner. I'd sit at that mahogany dining table, listening to my father and Marcus debate the merits of different steel suppliers or argue about expansion into the Colorado Springs market, desperately wanting to contribute, to show that I understood the numbers, the logistics, the careful balance of risk and reward that kept construction projects profitable. But whenever I spoke up, whenever I offered an insight or asked a question that showed I'd been paying attention, my father would get that look, that mixture of impatience and disappointment, as if my very participation was somehow inappropriate. "Angela, let the men handle the business talk," he'd say, not unkindly, but with the casual dismissal of someone who'd made up his mind about my capabilities years ago. "Why don't you tell us about your classes instead? How's that art history degree coming along?" He'd always emphasize art history like it was some frivolous indulgence he was tolerating, rather than acknowledging that I'd actually double majored in business administration as well, graduating summa cum laude while Marcus had barely scraped with his MBA from a program his fraternity connections had gotten him into. The irony was that I'd never wanted to study art history. I'd wanted to study engineering, had gotten accepted to the Colorado School of Mines with a partial scholarship, based on my math and science scores. But when I'd shown my father the acceptance letter, excited to finally pursue something that would make me useful to Henderson Construction, he'd laughed that particular laugh that meant he found my ambitions amusing rather than admirable. "Engineering? Angela, sweetheart, construction is a man's world. You'd be miserable, and frankly, you'd make everyone else miserable too. Why don't you study something more suited to your temperament? Liberal arts, maybe. Get yourself a well-rounded education." So I'd compromised, double majoring in art history to keep the peace and business administration to keep my dreams alive, spending 4 years learning about Renaissance architecture while secretly devouring every book I could find about project management, cost estimation, and construction logistics. I'd graduate with honors in both fields, but only one degree ever got mentioned at family gatherings. Only one seemed to matter when people asked about my future plans. After college, I'd applied for entry-level positions at Henderson Construction, 3 separate times. 3 times my father had rejected my applications without even granting me an interview. "It wouldn't be appropriate," he'd explained when I'd finally cornered him in his home office one Sunday afternoon, surrounded by blueprints and budget spreadsheets that I could read as fluently as he could. People would say I was playing favorites, giving my daughter special treatment. "Besides, you don't have the background for this kind of work. No engineering degree, no real experience with construction management. Maybe try the marketing department at one of our competitors. Get some experience in the field. See if you actually like it." The suggestion that I might not actually like construction felt like a slap, especially since I'd been studying it independently for years, had taught myself AutoCAD and project management software, had even completed online certifications in construction safety and green building practices, all on my own time, with my own money, hoping that someday my father would see my dedication and give me a chance to prove myself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I'd taken a job at Morrison Brothers, Henderson Construction's biggest competitor, starting in their marketing department like my father had suggested, but with a secret plan that I'd never shared with anyone in my family. I wasn't going to stay in marketing. I was going to learn every aspect of their business, from the ground up, until I knew construction as well as any Henderson ever had. Better, if I could manage it. My first boss at Morrison Brothers was Janet Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who'd started as a secretary and worked her way up to vice president of operations through sheer competence and an unwillingness to accept limitations other people tried to place on her ambitions. She took one look at my resume, with its dual degrees and its obvious overqualification for an entry-level marketing position, and asked the question no one in my family had ever bothered to ask. "What do you actually want to do here, Angela? Because I don't hire people who are just passing through, and I don't waste time training someone who's going to get bored and leave in 6 months. If you want to be in marketing, great. We'll make you the best marketing coordinator in the industry. But if you want to be somewhere else, tell me now, and we'll figure out how to get you there." I'd stared at her across her cluttered desk, surrounded by construction schedules and safety reports and budget analyses, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that someone might actually take my ambitions seriously. "I want to learn everything," I'd told her. "Honestly, marketing, project management, client relations, budget planning, site supervision. I want to understand this business from every angle." Janet had smiled, the kind of smile that meant she recognized something familiar, something she'd once felt herself. "Then that's what we'll do. But I'm warning you, it's going to be harder than anything you've ever done. You'll work nights and weekends, you'll get dirty, you'll deal with subcontractors who think a woman's place is answering phones, not managing their schedules. And at the end of the day, you'll still have to prove yourself twice as hard as any man in this industry just to get half the respect. Are you ready for that?" I was more than ready. I was hungry for it. For the next 5 years, I threw myself into learning construction, with the kind of focused intensity I'd never been allowed to show at family dinners. I spent mornings in the marketing department, crafting proposals and managing client communications. But my afternoons were spent on job sites, wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots, learning to read blueprints not from textbooks, but from the actual plans that guided million-dollar projects. I learned to spot cost overruns before they happened, to negotiate with suppliers who thought they could take advantage of my inexperience, to manage crews of workers who initially saw me as Janet's pet project, but gradually came to respect my competence. I worked weekends, volunteering for the assignments nobody else wanted, the difficult clients and the problem projects that more experienced managers avoided. I took night classes in advanced project management, earned certifications in sustainable construction practices, and learned to use every piece of software that might give me an edge in an industry that still operated largely on relationships and reputation rather than pure merit. And slowly, quietly, I began to build something that my family never saw, never knew to look for. I wasn't just becoming competent at construction management, I was becoming exceptional. My projects came in under budget and ahead of schedule. My client satisfaction ratings were the highest in Morrison Brothers history. I developed innovative solutions for complex engineering challenges, saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars through efficient resource management, and built a reputation in the Denver construction community as someone who could handle the impossible projects that other managers wouldn't touch. But none of that mattered at family dinners, where the conversation still revolved around Marcus's latest promotion to senior vice president and Claire's engagement to the son of one of Henderson Construction's biggest clients. I'd sit there, listening to my father praise Marcus for landing a project that I knew I could have managed better, faster, more profitably, and I'd stay quiet, because what was the alternative? Tell them that their failure of a daughter was actually succeeding spectacularly at their biggest competitor? Explain that Morrison Brothers had promoted me to senior project manager after just 3 years, a timeline that was virtually unheard of in an industry that typically required decades of experience for that level of responsibility? They wouldn't have believed me, and even if they had, they wouldn't have been proud. They would have been embarrassed that I was succeeding somewhere else instead of finding my place in the family business, ashamed that I was working for the competition instead of supporting the Henderson legacy. So I kept my success to myself, showing up to family events with vague answers about my job in marketing, deflecting questions about my career with inquiries about Claire's wedding planning or Marcus's latest acquisition deal. I let them think I was still struggling to find my direction, still trying to figure out where I belonged, because it was easier than dealing with the complicated emotions that would come with revealing the truth. But the truth had a way of revealing itself, whether I was ready or not. And it started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March, just 2 weeks before my father's retirement party, from Richard Thompson, the chairman of Henderson Construction's board of directors. "Angela," he said, his voice carrying that formal tone he used for important business conversations, "I hope you don't mind me calling you directly, but I have a proposition that I think might interest you." Richard Thompson's call came on the kind of gray March morning that Denver does better than anywhere else, when the mountains disappear behind clouds and the city feels suspended between winter and spring. I was in my office at Morrison Brothers, reviewing the final budget reports for the Cherry Creek Medical Complex project, when my assistant Emma knocked on my door with that look she got when something important was happening. "Angela, there's a Richard Thompson from Henderson Construction on line 2, she said, lowering her voice even though my office door was closed. "He says it's urgent." My stomach dropped. Richard Thompson had been on Henderson Construction's board of directors for as long as I could remember, a silver-haired gentleman who'd attended every family barbecue and Christmas party throughout my childhood, always asking polite questions about school and later about college, but never with the kind of attention that suggested he was actually listening to my answers. He was my father's oldest friend, his college roommate, the man who'd helped him secure the initial funding to start Henderson Construction 40 years ago. If Richard was calling me at work, something significant was happening. "Angela," he said when I picked up the phone, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of warmth and formality that reminded me of Sunday dinners and board meetings. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything too important, but I wondered if you might have time for lunch today. There's something I'd like to discuss with you, and I'd prefer to do it in person." I glanced at my calendar, already mentally rearranging meetings to accommodate whatever this conversation was going to be. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. Is everything all right? Is it about Dad's retirement party?" "In a manner of speaking, yes," he said, and I could hear something in his voice that I couldn't quite identify. "How about the Cherry Creek Grill at noon? I'll make a reservation." The Cherry Creek Grill was the kind of restaurant where Denver's business elite conducted their most important conversations over perfectly prepared steaks and bottles of wine that cost more than most people's weekly salaries. It was also uncomfortably close to Henderson Construction's headquarters, which meant there was a chance I might run into my father or Marcus, neither of whom knew that I regularly had lunch meetings with clients and contractors in the same establishments they frequented. Richard was already seated when I arrived, occupying a corner booth that provided privacy and a clear view of the restaurant's entrance. He stood when he saw me approaching, extending his hand with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that belonged to a generation when business was still conducted with handshakes and verbal agreements. "Angela, you look well," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him. Professional, confident. I have to say, it's refreshing to see a young person who takes their appearance seriously in business settings. I smoothed my black blazer and thanked him, wondering where this conversation was heading. Richard had always been kind to me, but never particularly interested in my professional development. He belonged to my father's world, the world of golf course deals and private club memberships, where women were wives and daughters rather than colleagues and competitors. "I'll get straight to the point," Richard said after we'd ordered our meals. "The board of directors has been having some very serious conversations about Henderson Construction's leadership transition. Your father's retirement timeline has accelerated, some decisions we'd been postponing." I nodded, assuming this was leading to some kind of update about Marcus's promotion to CEO, possibly a request that I attend the announcement or help coordinate family logistics around the transition. "I understand. It's a big change for everyone." "It is indeed," Richard agreed, "which is why we've spent considerable time evaluating all of our options. Angela, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. How much do you know about Henderson Construction's current financial situation?" The question caught me off guard. I know what everyone knows, I suppose. Dad's built a successful company. You're one of the largest construction firms in Colorado. The retirement party suggests things are going well. Richard's expression grew serious. "What if I told you that Henderson Construction has been losing market share for the past 3 years? That we've had cost overruns on 60% of our major projects? That 2 of our biggest clients have terminated their contracts early due to timeline failures and quality issues?" I stared at him, processing this information that contradicted everything I'd heard at family dinners. I'd ask how that's possible, given the way my father and Marcus talk about the company's performance. Your father is a proud man, Angela. He built Henderson Construction from nothing, and admitting that it might be struggling under current management goes against everything he believes about his legacy. As for Marcus, Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. Marcus is a capable administrator, but he lacks the strategic vision and operational expertise that this industry demands. He's managed to maintain existing client relationships, but he hasn't secured a single major new contract in 18 months. I felt a familiar twist of frustration, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times when I'd watched my family celebrate mediocre achievements while ignoring genuine problems that needed attention. Why are you telling me this? Because the board has been quietly investigating solutions, and your name has come up in some very interesting conversations. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to the kind of confidential tone that meant serious business was being discussed. We've been hearing remarkable things about your work at Morrison Brothers, the Stapleton retail complex that came in 2 months early and 15% under budget, the hospital expansion that you managed during that supply chain crisis last year, the Innovation Center project that won 3 industry awards for sustainable construction practices. My heart started beating faster. Richard Thompson knew about my work, knew about projects that my own family had never heard me mention. How do you know about those projects? Angela, Henderson Construction and Morrison Brothers bid against each other regularly. We know our competition, and more importantly, we know who's responsible for their successes. Your reputation in this industry extends far beyond Morrison Brothers, and frankly, it's been a source of considerable frustration for our board that such talent is being employed by our primary competitor. He pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal documents that I recognized as project summaries, performance reviews, and industry certifications. My project summaries, my performance reviews, my certifications. We've been watching your career development for the past 2 years, and what we've seen is someone who understands construction management at a level that frankly surpasses anyone currently employed by Henderson Construction, including your brother. I stared at the documents, realizing that while my family had been dismissing my career as a marketing job at a competitor company, the board of directors of my father's own company had been quietly monitoring my professional achievements. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Thompson? I'm suggesting that Henderson Construction needs new leadership, someone with the technical expertise and strategic vision to guide the company through the next phase of growth. He closed the portfolio and looked at me directly. Someone who understands the industry from the ground up, who has proven they can manage complex projects and difficult clients, who has the innovative thinking necessary to compete in an evolving market. The implication of his words was starting to settle in, but it seemed too impossible to believe. You're talking about the CEO position. I'm talking about offering you the CEO position, contingent on your willingness to accept it and your ability to present a strategic plan for Henderson Construction's future growth. Richard's expression was completely serious now. The board has already voted on this decision. You would have full authority over operations, budget allocation, strategic planning, and personnel decisions. Your father would retain his position as chairman emeritus, but he would have no operational control over day-to-day business. I felt dizzy. The restaurant around us seemed to fade into background noise as I processed what Richard was telling me. Henderson Construction, the company that had rejected my job applications, the family business that I'd been told wasn't appropriate for my temperament, was offering me the position that my brother had been groomed for his entire life. What? About Marcus? What about my father's succession plan? Richard's expression grew careful. Marcus is a fine administrator, but administration isn't leadership. The construction industry is changing rapidly, and Henderson Construction needs someone who understands technological innovation, sustainable practices, and modern project management techniques. Marcus's approach to business is similar to your father's, which worked well in the past, but isn't sufficient for future growth. Does my father know about this offer? Your father will be informed of the board's decision at the retirement party, along with everyone else in attendance. Richard reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. Angela, I know this is unexpected, and I know it puts you in a difficult position with your family, but Henderson Construction needs someone with your capabilities, and frankly, you're the best candidate available. I pulled my hand back, needing space to think. Why now? Why not approach me months ago, privately, before making this decision? Because we needed to be certain that you were ready for this level of responsibility, and we needed to be certain that our decision was based on merit rather than family politics. Richard signaled the waiter for the check. We've spent 6 months evaluating your professional performance, conducting discrete reference checks with your clients and colleagues, and analyzing your approach to project management. Every evaluation confirmed what we suspected. You're not just qualified. For this position, you're the ideal candidate. The implications were staggering. In 2 weeks at my father's retirement party, in front of 300 guests, including every important person in Denver's construction industry, Richard Thompson would announce that the new CEO of Henderson Construction was the daughter my father had just publicly called his greatest failure. The same daughter who'd been rejected for entry-level positions, who'd been told she wasn't suited for construction work, who'd been advised to find her place somewhere else. I need time to think about this, I said, though part of me knew my answer already. This is a major decision, and it affects more than just my career. Of course, Richard agreed, standing as I gathered my purse and jacket. But Angela, I want you to understand something. This offer isn't charity, and it isn't an attempt to create family drama. Henderson Construction needs leadership that can guide the company into the next decade, and you're the person best equipped to provide that leadership. The board has complete confidence in your abilities. I walked back to Morrison Brothers, in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities and complications that I couldn't begin to untangle. Janet Chen took one look at my face when I returned to the office and immediately called me into her private conference room. "What happened at lunch?" she asked, closing the door behind us. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Janet was the one person who knew about my family dynamics, the one person who understood why I'd chosen to build my career at Morrison Brothers rather than fight for recognition at Henderson Construction. Over 5 years of working together, she'd become more than a mentor. She'd become the supportive female role model I'd never had in my own family. "Henderson Construction offered me the CEO position," I said, still not quite believing the words, as I spoke them. Janet sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. "The CEO position? Angela, that's incredible. That's the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime." Then her expression grew concerned. "But it's also Henderson Construction, which means it's your family's company, which means this is going to be complicated in ways that have nothing to do with business." I told her about the conversation with Richard Thompson, about the board's evaluation of my work, about the timeline that would lead to the announcement at my father's retirement party. Janet listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from excitement to concern to something that looked like protective anger. "So let me understand this correctly," she said when I finished. "Your father's company has been quietly monitoring your professional achievements for 2 years, while your father himself has been telling you that you're not suited for construction work. The board has decided that you're the best candidate to lead the company, while your father has been grooming your brother for the same position. And they're planning to announce this decision at a public event, in front of your entire family, without giving your father advance notice. That's about the size of it." Janet was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her working through the professional and personal implications of the situation. "Angela, this is an amazing opportunity, but it's also potentially devastating for your family relationships. Are you prepared for the consequences of accepting this position?" It was the question I'd been avoiding since leaving the restaurant. Accepting the CEO position would mean acknowledging that I'd been building a successful career while letting my family believe I was struggling to find my direction. It would mean stepping into a role that Marcus had been expecting to inherit, potentially destroying my relationship with my brother. It would mean proving that my father had been wrong about my capabilities, but in a way that would humiliate him publicly. But it would also mean finally having the opportunity to show what I was capable of, to lead Henderson Construction in directions that my father and Marcus had never considered, to prove that the daughter they'd written off as a failure was actually the solution to problems they didn't even know they had. I don't know if I'm prepared for the consequences, I admitted, but I know I'm prepared for the job. Janet smiled, the kind of smile that meant she was proud of me but also worried about what I was walking into. Then I think you have your answer. But Angela, if you're going to do this, you need to be strategic about it. Don't just accept the position. Make sure you're accepting it on your terms. She was right, of course. This wasn't just about taking a job. It was about taking control of my professional destiny in a way that would inevitably reshape my family dynamics. If I was going to become CEO of Henderson Construction, I needed to do it with a clear vision of what I wanted to accomplish and how I intended to handle the personal complications that would inevitably arise. Over the next week, I threw myself into research with the same intensity I'd once applied to learning construction management. I analyzed Henderson Construction's financial reports, studied their recent project histories, identified the operational inefficiencies that had been causing their market share decline. I developed a comprehensive strategic plan that addressed their weaknesses while building on their traditional strengths, incorporating sustainable construction practices and technological innovations that would position them as industry leaders, rather than followers. But I also prepared for the personal challenges that accepting the position would create. I wrote and rewrote the conversation I would eventually need to have with my father, the explanation of how I'd built my career while keeping my achievements private, the justification for accepting a position that would disrupt his succession plans. I prepared for Marcus's anger, for my mother's concern about family harmony, for the inevitable accusations that I'd been working against Henderson Construction by building my expertise at a competitor company. Most importantly, I prepared for the moment when I would have to stand in front of 300 people and accept a position that no one in my family expected me to be offered, let alone qualified to handle. The moment when I would have to prove that the failure my father had described was actually the success he'd never bothered to recognize. The call from Richard Thompson came on Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week before the retirement party. "Angela, I hope you've had time to consider our offer," he said, his voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that meant he already knew what my answer would be. "I have," I replied, looking out my office window at the Denver skyline, at the buildings, and projects that I'd helped construct over the past 5 years. "I accept the position with conditions. I'm listening. I want complete operational authority, including the ability to restructure departments and modify existing contracts if necessary. I want to implement new project management systems and sustainable construction practices immediately, and I want the board's public support when my family inevitably challenges my qualifications or my approach to running the company." Richard chuckled, and I could hear approval in his voice. "Those conditions are exactly what we hoped you'd request. They tell us that you understand the scope of the challenges Henderson Construction is facing, and that you're prepared to address them decisively." Then we have an agreement. We do indeed. "Angela, I want you to know that the board is excited about Henderson Construction's future under your leadership. We believe you're exactly what the company needs." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the late afternoon light shift across the mountains, thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago, I'd been a recent college graduate with dual degrees and no clear professional direction, rejected by my family's company and uncertain about my place in an industry that seemed designed to exclude women like me. Now I was about to become CEO of that same company, armed with experience and expertise that my family had never bothered to recognize. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father's retirement party, The event where he would publicly label me his greatest failure would also be the event where his own company's board of directors would prove him spectacularly wrong. But I also knew that proving him wrong publicly would come with costs that I couldn't fully anticipate, consequences that would extend far beyond boardrooms and business strategies. As I packed up my office that evening, preparing to spend the weekend developing my transition plan for Henderson Construction, I thought about the conversation I would eventually need to have with Janet about leaving Morrison Brothers, about the mentorship that had made my success possible, about the gratitude I felt for a company that had seen my potential when my own family couldn't. But first, I had a retirement party to attend, a moment of public humiliation to endure, and a career-defining announcement to accept with the grace and professionalism that would set the tone for my leadership of Henderson Construction. The daughter. My father considered his only failure was about to become his successor, and neither of us was fully prepared for what that transformation would mean. The weekend before my father's retirement party passed in a blur of strategic planning and sleepless nights. I spread Henderson Construction's financial documents across my dining room table like battle plans, analyzing 5 years of declining performance that my family had somehow managed to disguise as continued success. The numbers told a story that contradicted every confident report I'd heard Marcus deliver at family gatherings, every proud announcement my father had made about new contracts and expansion opportunities. Henderson Construction was hemorrhaging money through inefficient project management, outdated technology systems, and a resistance to sustainable building practices that had cost them 3 major municipal contracts in the past 18 months. Their safety record, while not dangerous, lagged behind industry standards in ways that increased insurance costs and liability exposure. Most damaging of all, their reputation for timeline delays had spread throughout Denver's construction community, making them a second-choice contractor for the kind of high-profile projects that sustained long-term growth. I created detailed spreadsheets analyzing each problematic project, identifying the management decisions that had led to cost overruns and delays. The pattern was clear. Henderson Construction was being run like a company from 20 years ago, relying on personal relationships and traditional approaches in an industry that had evolved rapidly toward technological integration and environmental responsibility. Marcus's MBA had taught him financial management and administrative procedures, but it hadn't prepared him for the strategic innovation that modern construction required. By Sunday evening, I had developed a comprehensive 90-day improvement plan that addressed every major operational weakness I'd identified. New project management software that would streamline scheduling and budget tracking, partnerships with sustainable materials suppliers that would reduce costs while improving environmental compliance, safety protocol updates that would lower insurance premiums and improve worker satisfaction. Most importantly, a client relationship strategy that focused on building long-term partnerships rather than simply completing individual projects. But even as I worked through the technical details of transforming Henderson Construction's operations, I couldn't stop thinking about the personal dynamics that would make implementing these changes exponentially more complicated. Marcus would see every improvement I made as an implicit criticism of his management approach. My father would interpret any deviation from established practices as disrespect for the foundation he'd built. My mother would worry about family harmony being disrupted by business conflicts. The truth was that accepting the CEO position meant accepting responsibility not just for Henderson Construction's financial future, but for navigating the emotional minefield of displacing my brother from the role he'd been promised his entire life. Marcus had spent 15 years preparing to inherit leadership of the family company, earning his MBA, working his way up through various departments, building relationships with key clients and contractors. He'd bought a house in Cherry Hills Village specifically because it was close to Henderson Construction's headquarters. He'd joined the Denver Country Club because that's where construction industry networking happened. He'd structured his entire adult life around the assumption that he would eventually become CEO. And now, without warning, without explanation, that future was being handed to his younger sister, the family member who everyone agreed was least suited for business leadership. The sister who'd been gently discouraged from pursuing engineering, who'd been rejected for entry-level positions at the family company, who was supposed to be working in marketing at a competitor firm because she couldn't find her place in construction management. I spent Monday morning at Morrison Brothers preparing my resignation letter and scheduling individual conversations with my key clients to explain my departure. Janet had already begun identifying my replacement, a talented project manager named David Rodriguez, who'd been shadowing my work for the past 6 months. The transition would be smoother than most, but leaving Morrison Brothers still felt like abandoning the place where I'd discovered my professional identity. "You know this is the right decision," Janet said as we reviewed my client handover notes. "But I'm going to miss working with you. You've been the kind of employee every manager dreams of having." Her words carried weight because Janet wasn't given to excessive praise or emotional demonstrations. Over 5 years, she'd pushed me harder than any supervisor I'd ever had, demanding excellence while providing the kind of mentorship that had accelerated my professional development beyond what any formal training program could have achieved. "I'm terrified," I admitted, looking around the office that had been my professional home for so long. Not of the job itself, but of what accepting it means for my family relationships. "Family businesses are complicated," Janet agreed. "But Angela, you can't make career decisions based on other people's emotional reactions, even when those people are family members. You've earned this opportunity through 5 years of exceptional work, and Henderson Construction needs someone with your capabilities. If you turn down the CEO position to avoid family conflict, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." She was right, of course, but knowing something intellectually and feeling prepared for it emotionally were entirely different challenges. I could analyze Henderson Construction's operational problems and develop solutions with complete confidence. But I had no framework for managing the personal betrayal that Marcus would inevitably feel, or the disappointment that my father would experience when he realized that his succession plan had been overruled by his own board of directors. Tuesday brought an unexpected complication in the form of a phone call from Claire, my younger sister, who rarely contacted me about anything more serious than family event planning or social coordination. "Angela, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," she said, her voice carrying an unusual tension that immediately put me on alert. "What's going on?" "Marcus has been acting strange lately, nervous, almost paranoid. He keeps asking weird questions about Dad's retirement party, about who's going to be there, about whether there are any surprises planned." Claire paused, and I could hear her struggling with how much to reveal. "He seems to think something's going to happen at the party that he doesn't know about." My stomach clenched. If Marcus was already suspicious about the retirement party, it meant he'd somehow picked up on the board's unusual activity, possibly through administrative channels at Henderson Construction, or through conversations with other company executives. The last thing I wanted was for him to spend the next few days anticipating some kind of professional disappointment without understanding what was actually happening. "Why are you asking me?" "I don't know anything about Dad's retirement party." "Planning beyond the basic details." "Because you're the only person in our family who pays attention to things that other people miss," Claire said. "And because lately, I get the feeling that you know more about Henderson Construction's business than you let on at family dinners." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Claire had always been socially intuitive, skilled at reading people's emotions and motivations even when they were trying to hide them. If she'd noticed that I was more knowledgeable about construction industry dynamics than my supposed marketing job would explain, it meant I'd been less successful at maintaining my professional privacy than I'd thought. "Claire, I honestly don't know what's making Marcus nervous. Maybe he's just feeling the pressure of taking on more responsibility as Dad transitions into retirement." "Maybe," she agreed, but I could hear doubt in her voice. "Angela, can I ask you something else? Are you happy at Morrison Brothers?" Because lately, when business topics come up at family events, you get this look like you want to say something but you're holding back. The conversation was venturing into territory that I wasn't prepared to navigate, especially not 3 days before the retirement party. Claire's questions suggested that she'd been observing family dynamics more carefully than any of us had realized, and that she'd picked up on the tension between my apparent professional status and my actual level of industry knowledge. "I'm happy with my career," I said carefully. "But Claire, is there something specific you're worried about? Some reason you think something unusual is going to happen at the retirement party?" "I don't know. Maybe I'm just being paranoid because Marcus is being paranoid, but our family doesn't handle surprises well, and I have this feeling that Saturday night is going to be more complicated than anyone expects." After we hung up, I sat in my office staring at my computer screen, realizing that the retirement party was going to be even more emotionally fraught than I'd anticipated. If Marcus was already nervous about unknown developments, his reaction to the CEO announcement would be amplified by whatever anxiety he'd been building up over the past few days. And if Claire had noticed discrepancies between my stated job, responsibilities, and my actual industry expertise, other family members might have similar suspicions that would make the board's decision seem less surprising but more deliberately concealed. Wednesday brought the most difficult conversation I'd had since accepting the CEO position, explaining my resignation to Morrison Brothers' senior management team and my key clients. The construction industry in Denver was small enough that news of my departure would spread quickly, and I needed to ensure that my professional reputation remained intact regardless of how the Henderson Construction transition played out. My client meetings were uniformly positive, with several construction managers expressing interest in working with Henderson Construction if I was going to be leading their operations. The Stapleton project developer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Williams who'd become one of my most trusted professional contacts, was particularly encouraging. "Angela, this is exactly the kind of career move that the industry needs to see more of," she said as we reviewed the handover details for her upcoming retail complex project. "A woman with your track record taking leadership of a major construction firm sends a message that competence matters more than family connections or old boy networks." Her words were meant to be supportive, but they highlighted the external pressure that would accompany my new role. The Denver construction community would be watching my performance as Henderson Construction's CEO, not just to evaluate the company's future prospects, but to assess whether women could successfully lead major construction firms. My success or failure would have implications beyond my own career, potentially affecting opportunities for other women trying to advance in the industry. Thursday evening, I drove to my parents' house in Cherry Creek for our traditional family dinner, knowing it would be the last time I sat at that mahogany dining table without everyone knowing about my career transition. The house looked exactly the same as always, the kind of elegant but comfortable home that reflected my father's success without being ostentatious about it. The familiar sounds of my mother cooking in the kitchen and my father reading financial reports in his study created an atmosphere of normalcy that felt surreal given what I knew was coming. Marcus arrived 15 minutes late, looking harried and distracted in a way that confirmed Claire's observations about his recent anxiety. He'd always been punctual to family events, viewing them as extensions of business networking opportunities, so his tardiness suggested that something was genuinely troubling him. "Sorry I'm late," he said, loosening his tie as he joined us in the dining room. "Long day at the office, lots of moving parts with Dad's transition timeline." My father looked up from carving the roast. "Nothing you can't handle, son. Henderson Construction is in good hands." The confidence in his voice made my chest tighten. My father genuinely believed that Marcus was prepared to lead the company, genuinely trusted his judgment and capabilities. The board's decision to offer me the CEO position wasn't just going to disappoint Marcus. It was going to fundamentally challenge my father's assessment of his own legacy and succession planning. "Speaking of the transition," my mother said, passing the asparagus around the table, Are there any last-minute details we need to coordinate for Saturday's party? Any special arrangements or surprises we should know about? Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. What kind of surprises? Oh, you know how these events go, my mother replied, seemingly oblivious to the tension in his voice. Sometimes, the board likes to make special presentations or announcements. I just want to make sure we're prepared for anything that might come up. What kind of announcements? Marcus pressed, and I could see the anxiety that Claire had described building in his expression. My father laughed, the kind of comfortable chuckle that suggested he wasn't worried about any surprises. Marcus, relax. It's a retirement party, not a board meeting. Richard Thompson might make some remarks about company history. Maybe present me with a plaque or something ceremonial. Nothing that affects you or your responsibilities. I concentrated on cutting my meat, trying to keep my expression neutral, while listening to my father reassure Marcus about announcements that would completely upend both of their expectations. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable. I was sitting there with knowledge that would transform our family dynamics, while my father unknowingly dismissed the very developments that would prove his assessment of my capabilities spectacularly wrong. Angela, you've been quiet tonight, Claire observed, and I realized that my attempt to avoid participating in the conversation had itself become noticeable. Just tired, I said. Big project deadline at work. How are things at Morrison? Brothers? My father asked, the kind of polite inquiry that expected a brief general response. Still enjoying the marketing work? The question crystallized everything that was about to change. For 5 years, I'd been answering variations of that question with vague responses about client relations and promotional campaigns, allowing my family to maintain their assumptions about my professional limitations while I built expertise that surpassed their own. In less than 48 hours, those assumptions would be shattered in the most public way possible. It's been educational, I said, which was true enough without being revealing. Well, you've certainly stuck with it longer than we expected, my mother said with the kind of gentle encouragement that suggested she still hoped I'd eventually find something more suitable to my temperament. Maybe after you get more experience, some opportunities will open up in the industry. Marcus snorted softly. The construction industry isn't exactly welcoming to people without technical backgrounds. Marketing skills don't translate to project management or operational oversight. His dismissive tone was familiar, but for the first time in years, it didn't sting. Instead, I felt a calm certainty about the conversation we'd be having very soon, when he'd learn exactly how well marketing skills could translate to operational oversight when they were combined with 5 years of intensive construction management experience. You never know, I said mildly. Sometimes people surprise you. Friday passed in a haze of final preparations and mounting anxiety. I spent the morning at Morrison Brothers completing my last project reviews and client handovers, then drove to Henderson Construction's headquarters to meet with Richard Thompson and review the logistics for Saturday evening's announcement. The building looked different to me now that I knew I'd soon be working there. The glass and steel facade representing not just my father's legacy, but my own future professional home. The lobby, with its polished marble floors and framed photographs of major construction projects, would soon showcase projects that I'd managed and decisions that I'd made. Richard's office occupied a corner of the executive floor, with windows overlooking downtown Denver and the mountains beyond. The view was spectacular, but I found myself thinking about the operational challenges that view represented. The weather, delays that complicated construction schedules, the seasonal workforce fluctuations that affected project timelines, the environmental regulations that shaped material choices and construction methods. Are you ready for tomorrow night? Richard asked, settling into his chair across from me. As ready as I can be, I replied. I've prepared remarks for accepting the position, and I've developed a preliminary strategic plan for the first 90 days. Excellent. And how are you feeling about the family dynamics aspect of this transition? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I'm concerned about the impact on my relationships with my father and my brother. But I'm also confident that Henderson Construction needs the kind of leadership I can provide. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Angela, I want you to understand that the board didn't make this decision lightly. We've watched Henderson Construction's performance decline over the past 3 years, and we've watched your professional development at Morrison Brothers during the same period. The contrast is striking, and it's convinced us that you're not just a good candidate for this position, you're the right candidate. His words were reassuring, but they didn't eliminate the personal complications that accepting the position would create. Tomorrow night, in front of 300 guests, I would have to stand up and accept a job that my family didn't know I'd been offered, demonstrating expertise that my family didn't know I possessed, while my father and brother processed the reality that everything they'd assumed about Henderson Construction's future leadership had been wrong. The retirement party was less than 24 hours away, and I still had no idea how to prepare for the moment when my professional success would collide with my family's expectations in the most public way possible. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline Colorado sunshine that made the mountains look close enough to touch, and the city sparkle like a promise. I stood at my apartment window, coffee in hand, watching Denver wake up below me, knowing that by evening, everything would be different. Not just for me, but for my entire family, for Henderson Construction, for the carefully constructed narrative about my professional capabilities that had shaped family dynamics for the past 5 years. My dress hung on the closet door, a deep burgundy sheath that struck the right balance between professional authority and family event appropriateness. I'd chosen it carefully, wanting to look confident but not confrontational, successful but not ostentatious. The jewelry was simple, elegant pieces I'd bought for myself over the years, not gifts from family members that carried emotional complications or expectations about gratitude. The retirement party was scheduled to begin at 6, with dinner at 7 and speeches starting around 8:30. Richard Thompson had confirmed that the CEO announcement would come at 9:15, after my father's farewell remarks, but before, the evening wound down into casual socializing. The timing was strategic, ensuring that the announcement would have maximum impact while giving people time to process the news before the event concluded. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire asking if I needed a ride to the hotel, a thoughtful gesture that reminded me how much I valued my sister's kindness, even when I couldn't share the complexities of my professional life with her. I declined the ride, knowing that I'd need the independence of having my own transportation for whatever emotional aftermath the evening would bring. By 3 o'clock, I was ready except for getting dressed, and the waiting was becoming unbearable. I'd reviewed my acceptance remarks so many times that I could recite them from memory, but I continued reading through them anyway, looking for phrases that might sound defensive or apologetic, when what I needed to project was confidence and competence. The challenge was acknowledging the unexpected nature of my appointment while demonstrating that I was genuinely qualified for the position, not just a surprising choice. At 4:30, my phone rang with a call from Marcus, his voice carrying the strained cheerfulness that meant he was trying to manage anxiety through forced optimism. "Hey, Angela, I know you're probably getting ready for tonight, but I wanted to check something with you," he said, and I could hear traffic noise in the background suggesting he was driving while making the call. "What's going on? Have you talked to Mom or Dad about tonight's program? About who's speaking or what kind of presentations they're planning?" His questions were casual, but there was an undercurrent of concern that suggested he'd been thinking about this all day. "Not really. Why?" "I don't know. Probably nothing. It's just that some people at the office have been acting weird lately, like there's something happening that I don't know about. And then yesterday, Richard Thompson's assistant called to confirm that I'd be attending tonight, which seemed like an odd thing to need confirmation about." My heart rate accelerated. If Marcus was picking up on administrative signals that suggested unusual developments, His reaction to the CEO announcement would be complicated by whatever suspicions he'd been building throughout the week. The surprise would be layered with a sense that he should have seen it coming, that he'd missed important signals about his own professional future. Maybe they're just being thorough about the guest list, I suggested, trying to keep my voice neutral. It's a big event with a lot of important people attending. Maybe, Marcus agreed, but I could hear doubt in his voice. Angela, can I ask you something? And I want you to be honest with me. Of course. Do you think I'm ready to be CEO of Henderson Construction? The question came out in a rush, as if he'd been working up the courage to ask it all week. The question hit me like a physical blow. Marcus was reaching out to me, of all people, for reassurance about his professional capabilities on the same day that I was preparing to accept the position he'd been promised. The irony was cruel, but the vulnerability in his voice was genuine, and I found myself struggling to respond with anything approaching honesty. Marcus, you've been working at Henderson Construction for 15 years. You know the clients. You understand the operations. You have Dad's confidence and the respect of the employees. All of which was true, even if it wasn't a complete answer to his question. But do you think I'm ready? Not just prepared by experience, but actually ready to lead the company forward? He pressed, and I realized he was asking because he'd been having doubts about his own qualifications, doubts that would make the evening's announcement even more devastating. I think you care about Henderson Construction's success, and I think you want to honor Dad's legacy, I said, which was as close to honest as I could manage without revealing what I knew about the board's decision. Thanks, he said, and I could hear some of the tension leave his voice. I guess I'm just nervous about the responsibility. It's a lot to live up to. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at my phone, feeling the weight of the conversation and the evening ahead. Marcus wasn't just going to be surprised by the CEO announcement. He was going to be blindsided while already feeling vulnerable about his professional capabilities. The board's decision to bypass him would confirm doubts he was already having about his readiness for leadership, making the rejection feel like a judgment about his fundamental competence rather than a strategic choice about Henderson Construction's future direction. I spent the next hour trying to imagine the conversation Marcus and I would eventually need to have. The explanation of how I'd built my expertise while he'd assumed I was struggling with career direction. The justification for accepting a position that displaced him from his expected inheritance. Every version of that conversation ended badly, with hurt feelings and damaged relationships that might never fully recover. At 5:30, I finally got dressed, taking time with my makeup and hair in a way that felt both important and absurd. The reflection in my bedroom mirror showed a professional woman who looked confident and capable, someone who belonged in corporate leadership roles and high-stakes business environments. But it also showed my father's daughter, Marcus's sister, a family member who was about to disrupt decades of assumptions and expectations in the most public way possible. The Denver Marriott's grand ballroom was transformed when I arrived, elegant lighting and floral arrangements creating an atmosphere of celebration and achievement. Round tables filled the space, each set for 10 guests with centerpieces that incorporated Henderson Construction's logo and color scheme. The guest list represented the elite of Denver's construction and development community, along with family friends, longtime employees, and city officials who'd worked with my father over the decades. I found my assigned table near the front of the room, positioned with clear sight lines to the podium where the evening's speeches would be delivered. My table mates included several Henderson Construction Board members and their spouses, along with Patricia Williams from the Stapleton Project and another client who'd worked with me at Morrison Brothers. The seating arrangement felt strategic, surrounding me with people who knew my professional capabilities and could provide support during what was certain to be an emotionally complicated evening. My family's table was positioned at the center of the room, a place of honor that reflected my father's status as the guest of honor and retiring CEO. I could see my parents greeting guests, my father looking distinguished in his charcoal suit, my mother elegant in navy blue that complemented her silver hair. Marcus moved between tables with the kind of confident networking energy that came naturally to him, shaking hands and making small talk with the ease of someone who'd grown up in this environment. Claire waved when she spotted me, looking beautiful, in an emerald green dress that brought out her eyes. She was seated next to her fiancé David, a decent guy who worked in finance and understood family business dynamics enough to stay out of Henderson Construction politics. I wondered what Claire would think about the evening's developments, whether she'd be excited about my career advancement or concerned about the impact on family relationships. At 7 o'clock, guests began moving toward their tables as the waitstaff prepared to serve dinner. I took my seat between Patricia Williams and board member Sarah Martinez, both women who'd built successful careers in male-dominated industries and understood the unique challenges that came with breaking professional barriers. "Angela, I have to tell you how excited I am about tonight," Patricia said quietly as we settled into our chairs. "The construction community needs more women in leadership roles, and your appointment as CEO is going to open doors for a lot of talented people." Her comment confirmed that at least some guests knew about the announcement before it was made, which meant that news of my appointment had circulated among certain professional circles, even while my family remained unaware. The selective disclosure added another layer of complexity to the evening, suggesting that the board had been preparing the construction community for Henderson Construction's leadership transition while deliberately keeping my family uninformed. Dinner conversation at our table was polite, but charged with anticipation. Everyone aware that something significant was going to happen, but uncertain about exactly what form that significance would take. Sarah Martinez mentioned that Henderson Construction was entering an important growth phase that would require innovative leadership approaches. Patricia Williams talked about the changing dynamics in Denver's construction market and the importance of companies that could adapt to new environmental regulations and technological innovations. I participated in the conversation while watching my family's table, observing the interactions that would soon be complicated by professional developments none of them expected. My father looked relaxed and happy, a man celebrating the successful conclusion of a career he'd built from nothing. Marcus appeared more at ease than he'd sounded on the phone, probably reassured by the familiar environment and the recognition he was receiving from industry colleagues who assumed he'd soon be stepping into leadership. At 8:15, Richard Thompson approached the podium and called for attention, beginning the evening's formal program with remarks about my father's 40-year contribution to Denver's construction industry. His speech was warm and appreciative, highlighting specific projects and innovations that had established Henderson Construction's reputation while building toward the leadership transition that everyone expected to center around Marcus's promotion. My father's response was vintage Robert Henderson, confident and gracious, acknowledging the team members and family support that had made his success possible while expressing optimism about Henderson Construction's future under new leadership. He talked about the pride he felt in building a company that would continue serving Denver's construction needs for generations to come, about the satisfaction of knowing that his life's work would be carried forward by people who shared his commitment to quality and integrity. "The construction industry has been my passion for 4 decades, but my greatest pride has always been my family," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority that had made him a respected business leader. "I've been blessed with 3 children, and I'm proud to say that 2 of them have exceeded every expectation I had as a father." The familiar words hit me like a physical shock, even though I'd known they were coming. Hearing my father describe me as his greatest failure while I sat 20 feet away, knowing that in less than an hour I'd be announced as his successor, created a surreal disconnect between public humiliation and private vindication that I hadn't fully prepared for. "Marcus has grown into the kind of leader that any father would be proud to call his son," my father continued, his voice warm with genuine affection. "His dedication to Henderson Construction, his understanding of our industry, and his commitment to our family values make him the ideal person to guide the company forward. Marcus smiled and nodded acknowledgement, looking comfortable with praise that reinforced his expectation of inheriting leadership. Several guests at his table clapped appreciatively, recognizing the implicit announcement of succession that seemed to be unfolding. "Claire has brought joy and grace to our family, in ways that continue to amaze me," my father went on. "Her engagement to David represents the kind of personal happiness that makes all professional success meaningful." Then his expression grew more serious, his tone shifting in a way that made the ballroom quieter. "But every family has its challenges, its disappointments, its members who struggle to find their place despite every opportunity and encouragement." The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding that something uncomfortable was about to be said, but uncertain about how to react. "Angela has always been my greatest challenge as a father," he said, his voice carrying resignation, rather than anger. "Despite every advantage, every opportunity I've tried to provide, she's never quite managed to establish herself professionally or personally in ways that reflect the Henderson family values and ambitions." I felt Patricia Williams's hand touch my arm under the table, a gesture of support that anchored me as my father's words washed over the room. Several people glanced in my direction with expressions ranging from sympathy to embarrassment, unclear about how to process public criticism of a family member at what was supposed to be a celebration. "I take responsibility for Angela's struggles," my father continued. "Perhaps I expected too much, or perhaps I didn't provide the right kind of guidance. But I've learned that sometimes, despite our best efforts as parents, our children choose paths that lead away from, rather than toward the goals we'd hoped they'd achieve. The cruelty wasn't intentional," I realized. My father genuinely believed that he was acknowledging a family disappointment with the kind of honesty that demonstrated his character and integrity. He thought he was taking responsibility for my perceived failures while celebrating the successes of his other children. He had no idea that he was publicly humiliating someone who'd spent 5 years building expertise that exceeded his own. Someone who'd been chosen by his own board of directors to lead the company he'd spent 40 years building. Marcus looked uncomfortable but not surprised, confirming that family conversations about my professional limitations had been ongoing for years. Claire's expression was harder to read, a mixture of sadness and something that might have been anger at seeing her sister criticized so publicly. "But tonight isn't about disappointments," my father concluded, his voice regaining its celebratory tone. "Tonight is about celebrating Henderson Construction's future and the leadership that will guide us forward. I'm confident that the company I've built will continue to thrive under new management." He raised his champagne glass, and 300 guests rose to join his toast to Henderson Construction's continued success. I stood with everyone else, lifting my glass while knowing that in 15 minutes, every assumption that had shaped that toast would be shattered. Richard Thompson returned to the podium as applause faded, his expression serious in a way that suggested the evening's program was entering a different phase. "Thank you, Robert, for those heartfelt remarks about your family and your career," he began. "Before we conclude this evening's celebration, the board of directors has an important announcement about Henderson Construction's leadership transition." The energy in the room shifted, guests settling back into their chairs with the kind of focused attention that significant business announcements demanded. Marcus straightened in his chair, probably expecting formal confirmation of his promotion to CEO. My father looked relaxed and proud, anticipating recognition of the succession planning that had prepared his son for leadership. Effective Monday. Morning. Henderson Construction will begin operating under new executive leadership, Richard continued. After extensive evaluation of candidates both within and outside the company, the board of directors has selected someone whose qualifications, vision, and track record make her uniquely suited to guide Henderson Construction into its next phase of growth. The use of "her" created a ripple of surprise through the audience, followed by an even deeper silence as guests processed the implications. My father's expression shifted from relaxed confidence to confusion. clearly trying to understand how a female CEO fit into his succession planning. Marcus looked stunned, the color draining from his face as he realized that the announcement wasn't going to confirm his expected promotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce Henderson Construction's new Chief Executive Officer, Angela Henderson." The ballroom erupted into applause that felt like thunder, a combination of genuine enthusiasm and professional courtesy that created a wall of sound I had to walk through to reach the podium. I stood slowly, my legs steady despite the adrenaline, coursing through my system, and moved toward the front of the room while 300 pairs of eyes tracked my progress. The walk to the podium felt both endless and instantaneous, each step carrying me further from the daughter my father had just described as his greatest failure, and closer to the CEO that Henderson Construction's board of directors had chosen to lead the company forward. Behind me, I could hear the applause continuing, but I could also sense the shock and confusion rippling through my family's table as they processed what was happening. When I reached the podium and turned to face the audience, the applause gradually faded into expectant silence. My father sat frozen in his chair, his expression cycling between confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been recognition that everything he'd assumed about my professional capabilities had been spectacularly wrong. Marcus stared at me with an expression of betrayal and bewilderment, clearly struggling to understand how his sister had been offered the position he'd been promised. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady and clear as it carried across the ballroom. Microphone. "This is certainly not how I expected this evening to unfold." The silence in the ballroom was profound. 300 people waiting to see how I would handle the most professionally and personally significant moment of my life. I looked out at faces that ranged from supportive to shocked to confused, finally settling on my family's table where my father sat rigid with disbelief, and Marcus stared at me with an expression of profound betrayal. 5 years ago, I applied for an entry-level position at Henderson Construction and was told that I wasn't suited for this industry. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. I was advised to find work elsewhere, to build experience, in fields that might be more appropriate for my temperament and capabilities. I could see my father's face tightening as he began to understand where my remarks were heading, recognition dawning that the daughter he'd just described as his greatest failure was about to reveal professional achievements he'd never bothered to discover. So I took that advice. I joined Morrison Brothers Construction, starting in their marketing department, with the intention of learning everything I could about this industry that I was told didn't have room for someone like me. I paused, letting that information settle. Over the past 5 years, I've managed 47 major construction projects with a combined value of over $200 million. I've maintained a 96% client satisfaction rating, brought projects in an average of 8% under budget, and earned industry recognition for innovative approaches to sustainable construction and project management efficiency. The applause that followed was spontaneous and enthusiastic, led by Patricia Williams and several other guests who knew my professional record. But I kept my eyes on my family's table, watching my father's expression shift from confusion to something approaching recognition as he processed what I was telling him. The Stapleton retail complex that won 3 industry awards for sustainable design? I managed that project. The Cherry Creek Medical Center that came in 2 months ahead of schedule during last year's supply chain crisis? That was my project, too. The Innovation District mixed-use development that's being studied as a model for urban construction efficiency? I developed the project management protocols that made that success possible. Marcus was shaking his head slowly, as if he could somehow deny what he was hearing. My mother had gone pale, her hands pressed flat against the table as she struggled to process the disconnect between the daughter she thought she knew and the professional achievements I was describing. I didn't share these accomplishments with my family because I was building my expertise at a competitor company, and I didn't want to create conflicts of interest or professional awkwardness, I continued. But I also didn't share them because I'd been told so many times that I wasn't suited for construction management that I began to believe that my success must be somehow illegitimate, somehow not worthy of recognition or pride. The ballroom was completely quiet now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something more than a business announcement. This was a personal reckoning, a daughter claiming recognition that had been denied, and asserting capabilities that had been dismissed. When the board of directors approached me about leading Henderson Construction, I was honored but also terrified. Not because I doubted my qualifications for the position, but because I knew that accepting it would require me to stop hiding my professional identity from the people whose approval I'd spent my entire life seeking. I looked directly at my father, seeing something in his expression that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Dad, when you spoke tonight about disappointment and failure, you were describing someone you never really knew. You were talking about a daughter who couldn't find her place in the world, but that daughter hasn't existed for 5 years. She hasn't existed since the day I decided to prove that I belonged in this industry whether you believed it or not." The emotion in my voice was genuine, years of frustration and hurt finally finding expression in the most public forum possible. I've spent 5 years building expertise that I was afraid to share with you because I knew you wouldn't believe. It was real. I've hidden my success because I thought it would be easier than confronting your assumptions about my capabilities. But tonight, standing here as Henderson Construction's new CEO, I realized that hiding my achievements was a disservice not just to myself, but to every woman in this industry who's been told she doesn't belong. The applause that followed was sustained and powerful, a recognition not just of my appointment, but of the broader significance of what was happening. I could see women throughout the audience nodding, understanding the particular challenge of proving professional worth in environments that questioned your fundamental capabilities. "Henderson Construction is entering a new phase of growth and innovation," I said, transitioning into the business vision that would define my leadership. "We're going to implement cutting-edge project management systems, expand our sustainable construction capabilities, and build partnerships that position us as the premier construction firm in Colorado. We're going to honor the foundation that my father built while adapting to an industry that demands technological innovation and environmental responsibility." I outlined my strategic plan in broad terms, describing improvements that would address the operational inefficiencies that had been damaging Henderson Construction's competitiveness. As I spoke, I could see several board members nodding approvingly, recognizing ideas we'd discussed in planning meetings and confident that I understood the challenges the company was facing. But most importantly, Henderson Construction is going to be a company where talent is recognized regardless of gender, where innovation is valued over tradition when tradition isn't serving our clients' needs, and where success is measured by the quality of our work rather than the comfort of our assumptions. When I finished speaking, the standing ovation was immediate and sustained. Patricia Williams was on her feet first, followed by Sarah Martinez and the other board members, then spreading throughout the ballroom as guests recognized both the significance of my appointment and the vision I'd articulated for Henderson Construction's future. As the applause continued, I stepped away from the podium and walked back toward the tables, knowing that the real challenge was just beginning. The public part of the evening was over, but the personal conversations that would determine my family relationships going forward were about to begin. My father intercepted me before I could reach my table, his expression serious but no longer angry. "Angela, I need to speak with you privately." We found a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the guests who were still processing what they'd witnessed. For a long moment, we stood looking at each other, 40 years of father-daughter dynamics suddenly complicated by professional realities that neither of us had anticipated. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that I'd never heard before. "Not just for tonight, but for years of not seeing who you really are." "Dad, you don't need to apologize for not knowing about my career at Morrison Brothers. I made a deliberate choice to keep that information private. No, Angela, I do need to apologize. I need to apologize for creating an environment where you felt like success had to be hidden, where you believed that your achievements wouldn't be welcomed or celebrated by your own family. He paused, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I need to apologize for being so invested in my assumptions about your capabilities that I never bothered to discover what you were actually capable of. The conversation I'd been dreading for weeks was turning out to be nothing like what I'd expected. My father wasn't angry about being blindsided or defensive about his assessment of my professional potential. He was genuinely remorseful about the family dynamics that had made my success feel like something that needed to be concealed. I'm proud of you, he said simply. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm proud that you're going to be leading Henderson Construction. But I'm also ashamed that it took a board of directors' decision to make me realize how wrong I've been about my own daughter. Across the ballroom, I could see Marcus approaching, his expression grim but determined. The conversation with my father had been unexpectedly healing, but I knew that my brother's reaction would be more complicated, shaped by professional disappointment and personal betrayal that wouldn't be easily resolved. Angela, we need to talk, Marcus said when he reached us, his voice tight with controlled emotion. My father looked between us, understanding that this conversation needed to happen without parental mediation. I'll leave you two to work this out, he said, squeezing my shoulder before walking back toward the main reception area. Marcus and I found an empty conference room adjacent to the ballroom, a neutral space where we could have the conversation that would determine whether our relationship could survive the evening's developments. How long have you known? Asked as soon as the door closed behind us. About the CEO position? Richard Thompson approached me 2 weeks ago. No, Angela. How long have you known that you were building a career that would eventually displace me from Henderson Construction? His voice was steady, but I could hear years of hurt and confusion underneath the professional control. The question was fair, but complicated. Marcus, I never planned to take your place at Henderson Construction. I built my career at Morrison. Brothers, because I was told I wasn't qualified to work at our family's company. Everything I've accomplished over the past 5 years was about proving to myself that I belonged in this industry, not about positioning myself to take over Dad's business. But you knew, he pressed. You knew that your success was making you a candidate for leadership roles, and you knew that those roles might include Henderson Construction. He was right, and we both knew it. Over the past 2 years, as my reputation in Denver's construction community had grown, I'd begun to understand that my professional achievements were creating opportunities that might eventually intersect with my family's business. I'd known that the board was aware of my work, and I'd suspected that they might approach me about consulting or advisory roles. I knew that my success might create opportunities with Henderson Construction, I admitted, but I never imagined that the board would offer me the CEO position without discussing it with Dad first, and I never wanted to displace you from a role you'd been promised. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing my response and deciding how much of his hurt and anger he wanted to express. Angela, do you understand what this means for me? I've spent 15 years of my life preparing to lead Henderson Construction. I bought a house based on the assumption that I'd be working at the company indefinitely. I made career decisions, relationship decisions, financial decisions, all based on the understanding that I would eventually inherit Dad's business. The pain in his voice was genuine, and I felt the full weight of how my professional success had disrupted not just his career expectations, but his entire life plan. I understand, and I'm sorry. I never wanted my achievements to come at the cost of your professional future. But they have, he said simply. The board chose you over me, which means they don't believe I'm capable of leading Henderson Construction effectively. That's not just a business decision, Angela. That's a judgment about my professional competence, and it's a judgment that's been made public in front of everyone we know in this industry. I realized that Marcus's reaction wasn't just about losing the CEO position. It was about the public nature of that loss and what it suggested about his capabilities relative to mine. The board's decision to choose me over him would be interpreted by the construction community as evidence that I was significantly more qualified for leadership, which would affect his professional reputation beyond Henderson Construction. Marcus, the board's decision wasn't a judgment about your incompetence. It was a strategic choice about the kind of leadership Henderson Construction needs for future growth. You're a skilled administrator and project manager, but the company needs someone with experience in innovation and sustainable practices, someone who understands the technological changes that are reshaping the industry. "Someone like you," he said, and I could hear acceptance beginning to compete with anger in his voice. "Someone with my specific background and experience? Yes. But that doesn't mean you're not capable of successful leadership in other contexts or other companies." We talked for another 20 minutes, working through the immediate emotional aftermath of the evening's announcement and beginning to explore how our relationship might evolve now that our professional roles had been dramatically redefined. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it didn't resolve all the hurt feelings or complicated dynamics that would need to be addressed over time. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that we both wanted to preserve our relationship despite the professional disappointment that would always be part of our shared history. When we returned to the ballroom, the reception was winding down, guests gradually departing with handshakes and congratulations that felt surreal after the intensity of the family conversations I'd just navigated. Claire approached me as I was collecting my purse and jacket, her expression combining pride with concern in ways that perfectly captured the evening's emotional complexity. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm excited about what you're going to do with Henderson Construction, but I'm also worried about how this changes our family dynamics." Her honesty was refreshing after an evening of managing complicated emotions and diplomatic conversations. "I'm worried about that too. But Claire, I couldn't keep hiding who I really am professionally just to avoid disrupting family expectations." "I know," she said, hugging me tightly. "And I think tonight was exactly what our family needed, even if it was painful. We've all been operating with assumptions about each other that weren't actually true." As I drove home that night, through Denver streets that looked the same but felt different now that my professional identity was no longer a secret, I thought about the conversations that had defined the evening and the relationships that would need to be rebuilt on more honest foundations. The retirement party had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped. It had established my legitimacy as Henderson Construction's new CEO, while forcing my family to confront their assumptions about my capabilities. But it had also begun a process of personal and professional transformation that would extend far beyond a single evening's drama. Starting Monday morning, I would be responsible for leading a company that employed 300 people and managed millions of dollars in construction projects. I would be accountable to clients, employees, board members, and industry colleagues who would evaluate my performance against the highest standards of professional competence. More importantly, I would be proving that the daughter my father had called his greatest failure was actually the leader Henderson Construction needed for its next phase of growth. The woman who'd been told she wasn't suited for construction work was about to demonstrate that she understood the industry better than anyone had imagined, including herself. 6 months later, Henderson Construction had its most profitable quarter in 5 years. We'd secured 4 major new contracts, implemented project management systems that improved efficiency by 23%, and earned recognition as Denver's most innovative construction firm. My relationship with my father had evolved into something stronger and more respectful than it had ever been when I was trying to earn his approval. Marcus had accepted a senior position with a construction firm in Phoenix, where his administrative skills were appreciated and where he could build success without competing with his sister's shadow. The night my father called me his only failure had indeed rewritten the Henderson legacy, but not in the way anyone had expected. It had revealed that success sometimes requires the courage to stop hiding your achievements, even when sharing Them disrupts the comfortable narratives that families use to understand themselves. It had proven that the most profound transformations often begin with the willingness to stand up and claim the recognition you've earned, regardless of who might be surprised by your qualifications. I was never my father's failure. I was his daughter who refused to accept limitations that didn't match her capabilities, who built expertise in environments that valued competence over assumptions, and who eventually claimed leadership that reflected her true professional identity rather than her family's expectations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.